My stepbrother, David, always seemed to have everything figured out. A beautiful house, a high-paying job, and a wife, Alyssa, who was the envy of every man who met her. Alyssa wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. She had this way of making everyone feel like the center of the universe, and it was easy to see why David had fallen for her. I'd been close with David for years, despite us only becoming family in our 20s when our parents remarried. We weren't blood, but we might as well have been. I spent a lot of time at their place, especially after my last breakup. David and Alyssa were welcoming, always treating me like part of their inner circle. It started innocently enough. David would have his friends over for drinks or poker night, and Alyssa, always the gracious hostess, would join in. I'd catch the occasional glance from one of David's friends, a look that lingered too long on Alyssa's laugh or the way she moved around the room, but I figured it was harmless. Everyone admired her. What I didn't realize was how far that admiration would go. The first time I noticed something was off, it was a Saturday afternoon. David had invited a few of his friends over to watch the game, and Alyssa was in the kitchen, making snacks. I caught one of his buddies, Jake, standing a little too close to her as she prepared a tray of nachos. He leaned in, whispering something that made her laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh you gave to a harmless joke, it was softer, almost intimate. David didn't notice. He was too engrossed in the game, cheering loudly with a beer in hand. I told myself I was overthinking it. Jake had always been a flirt, and Alyssa was just being polite. But then it started happening more often. Jake, and sometimes other friends of David's, began dropping by the house unexpectedly. They'd claim it was to hang out with David, but half the time, he wasn't even home. Alyssa, ever the accommodating hostess, would let them in, offering drinks or snacks, and I'd catch snippets of their conversations, low voices, laughter that felt a little too personal. One evening, I came by to borrow some tools from David's garage. As I walked up the driveway, I saw through the window into the living room. Alyssa was on the couch with one of David's friends, Mark, I think. He was leaning in close, his hand resting on her thigh. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. I didn't say anything to David. How could I? Without proof, it would just sound like jealousy or paranoia. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The next time I went to David's house, things felt different. The energy was off, tense, though David didn't seem to notice. Alyssa, however, looked nervous, her usual cheerful demeanor muted. Jake was there again, this time under the pretense of borrowing tools for a project. He lingered in the kitchen, chatting with Alyssa while David and I sat on the porch, catching up. It wasn't until David excused himself to take a work call that I caught a moment alone with Jake. He leaned against the counter, a cocky smirk on his face as he sipped a beer. "You seem to come around here a lot these days," I said, trying to sound casual. Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "What can I say? Alyssa's great company. You don't seem to mind hanging around either." There was something in his tone, an edge, a challenge. My gut twisted. "Yeah, well, she's my brother's wife. I'm here for them." "Sure," Jake said, his smirk widening. He didn't say more, but the look he gave me was enough to confirm what I'd been suspecting. Something was happening, and it wasn't innocent. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things, that Jake was just being his usual flirtatious self. But a part of me couldn't let it go, and that part got louder when, a few days later, I decided to swing by the house unannounced. David had mentioned he'd be working late, so I figured I'd drop off some tools I'd borrowed and maybe grab a beer with Alyssa if she was home. What I didn't expect was to see Jake's car in the driveway. My stomach churned as I approached the door. It was ajar, just enough for me to hear voices inside. I froze, the sound of Alyssa's laughter cutting through me like a knife. It wasn't just laughter, it was intimate, breathless, the kind of laugh that told me exactly what was going on. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my heart pounding. The voices were coming from the living room. When I rounded the corner, I saw them. Alyssa was on the couch, her hair tousled, her dress pushed up to her thighs. Jake was beside her, his shirt unbuttoned, his hand on her leg. They both froze when they saw me, the color draining from their faces. "Are you kidding me?" I snapped, my voice trembling with anger. Alyssa scrambled to pull her dress down, her face pale. "It's not what it looks like." "Don't insult me," I interrupted, glaring at Jake. "Does David know about this?" Jake stood, his expression shifting from shock to defiance. "Why don't you mind your own business?" "This is my business," I shot back. "David is my brother." Alyssa started crying, mumbling something about how it was a mistake, how it didn't mean anything. But I couldn't focus on her words. All I could think about was David, how this would destroy him. "Get out," I said to Jake, my voice low and steady. "Now." He hesitated for a moment, then grabbed his shirt and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Alyssa collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Please," she said through her sobs. "Don't tell David." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, torn between loyalty to my brother and the weight of the secret I now carried. After Jake left, I sat across from Alyssa, the silence between us stretching unbearably. She was still crying, her hands trembling as she tried to explain. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice cracking. It got out of hand." I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the weight of what I'd seen left me speechless. Instead, I stood up, pacing the room as her words bounced around my head. "Does Jake come here often?" I finally asked, my tone cold. She hesitated, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. "Unbelievable," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "Please," she begged. "You can't tell David. He doesn't deserve this." "No, he doesn't," I snapped. "And yet here we are." I left before I said something I couldn't take back. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts consumed by the decision I now faced. If I told David the truth, it would destroy his marriage and likely his friendships. But if I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in Alyssa's betrayal. I didn't say anything to David. Not that night, not the next day. Part of me hoped that what I'd seen was a one-time mistake, something Alyssa regretted enough to never repeat. But deep down, I knew better. The next weekend, I went over to David's for a barbecue. Alyssa greeted me at the door, her face pale and her smile forced. She avoided my eyes, and I avoided hers. David's friends started arriving one by one. Jake wasn't there, which I was grateful for, but Mark and Tyler, two of David's other close friends, showed up, each with that same casual confidence I'd seen in Jake. As the afternoon wore on, I couldn't help but notice the way they interacted with Alyssa. Tyler lingered too long when she refilled his drink, his hand brushing hers. Mark stood a little too close when they talked, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made my stomach churn. And Alyssa? She didn't stop them. If anything, she encouraged it. A laugh here, a playful touch there, it was subtle, but I saw it for what it was. I realized then that Jake wasn't the exception. He was the beginning. A few days later, I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered Alyssa in the kitchen while David was outside mowing the lawn. "What are you doing?" I demanded, keeping my voice low but firm. She looked startled, glancing toward the window as if worried David might overhear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "First Jake, and now Mark and Tyler? Are you just working your way through David's friends?" Her face flushed with anger. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," I said, crossing my arms. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's not like I planned this," she said finally. "It just happened." "That's not an excuse," I said. "You're hurting David. And if you think I'm going to keep covering for you, you won't tell him," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't do that to him." She was right. As much as I hated what she was doing, the thought of breaking David's heart kept me silent. But my patience was wearing thin, and she knew it. The next time I caught her was with Mark. It was late, and I'd stopped by David's house to drop off a toolbox I'd borrowed. David wasn't home. He'd mentioned something about working late, and when Alyssa opened the door, she looked surprised to see me. "Everything okay?" I asked, already suspicious. "Yeah," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "David's not here." "I know," I said, stepping inside. "I just came to drop this off." As I walked into the living room, I saw him. Mark, sitting on the couch with a beer in hand, looking far too comfortable. Alyssa's face went pale. "It's not what it looks like," she said, but I didn't let her finish. "Save it," I said, turning to Mark. "Does David know you're here?" Mark set the beer down, standing up. "I think you should leave." "Me?" I said, my voice rising. "You're the one who doesn't belong here." Alyssa stepped between us, her hands up as if to calm me down. "Please," she said. "Let's not make this worse." "You've already done that," I said, glaring at her. "Both of you." I left before I could do something I'd regret. But as I drove home, my anger shifted to something darker, a resolve to finally put an end to this. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Alyssa's actions had gone too far, and I knew the longer I stayed silent, the worse it would get for David. Watching her entertain David's friends, her charm as sharp as a knife, felt like watching a slow-motion betrayal every time I was at their house. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. David had asked me to help him move some equipment from his garage to a storage unit, so I came by after work. When I arrived, David's car wasn't in the driveway. "Late meeting?" I asked Alyssa as she answered the door. "Yeah," she said, avoiding my eyes. "He won't be back until late." I should have walked away, but something felt off. I glanced past her into the house and noticed an extra pair of men's shoes by the door. "Is someone here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "No, just me." I didn't believe her. Pushing past her, I walked into the living room and froze. Mark was sitting on the couch, looking far too comfortable. He didn't even try to stand up or look ashamed. Instead, he raised his beer and smirked. "Hey, man," he said casually. Alyssa's face went pale. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I snapped, rounding on her. "What exactly am I supposed to think, Alyssa? That you're hosting a friendly hangout while David's at work?" Mark finally stood, his expression turning defensive. "Look, it's not your business." "It's absolutely my business," I shot back. "David is my brother, and you're supposed to be his friend." Before I could say more, Alyssa stepped between us. "Please, just leave," she said, her voice trembling. I glared at both of them, disgusted. "You're disgusting, both of you." Without another word, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Mark sitting on David's couch, smug and unrepentant, burned in my mind. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. David deserved to know. The next morning, I drove to David's office. He looked surprised to see me but waved me in, offering me a seat across from his desk. "What's up?" he asked. "You look serious." I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to say pressing down on me. "David, I need to talk to you about Alyssa." His brow furrowed. "What about her?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. About Jake. About Mark. About what I'd seen the night before. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he stood and walked to the window, his back to me. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Not long," I admitted. "But I should have told you sooner. I didn't know how." He turned to face me, his eyes blazing. "You didn't know how? How about you just tell me when my wife is cheating on me?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You were protecting her. All this time, she's been lying to me, and you let her get away with it." The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. "David, I swear I didn't mean." "Just stop," he said, holding up a hand. "I need time to think." I stood, unsure of what else to say. "If there's anything I can do..." There isn't, he said flatly. As I walked out of his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just shattered something irreparable. But deep down, I knew I'd done the right thing. The next time I heard from David, it was 2 days later. He called late at night, his voice flat and distant. I told her, he said. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. What happened? She admitted it, he said. Everything. Jake, Mark, Tyler, there's no denying it anymore. What did you do? I asked cautiously. I told her to pack her things and leave, he said. I'm done. Hearing those words should have brought some relief, but instead, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. David sounded broken, like he was barely holding himself together. Do you want me to come over? I asked. No, he said after a long pause. I need to be alone right now. The line went dead, and I was left staring at my phone, wondering how he was going to get through this. The next day, I stopped by David's house, even though he hadn't asked me to. The sight of his car in the driveway and Alyssa's missing told me everything I needed to know. When I knocked on the door, it took him a while to answer. He looked like he hadn't slept, his hair disheveled and dark circles under his eyes. Hey, I said softly. Can I come in? He stepped aside without a word, and I followed him into the living room. The place felt emptier without Alyssa's touch. No candles on the coffee table, no throw blankets draped over the couch. She left this morning, he said, sinking into a chair. Didn't even put up a fight. I sat across from him, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, man. I wish there was something I could do. He let out a bitter laugh. You already did. You told me the truth. For a while, we just sat there in silence. Then David spoke again, his voice trembling. You know what hurts the most, he said. It's not the cheating. It's the fact that she didn't even try to fix it. She didn't care enough to fight for us. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, letting him vent. She said it didn't mean anything, he continued, his hands clenched into fists. That it was just fun. Like our marriage was some kind of joke to her. David, I said carefully, this isn't your fault. He looked at me, his eyes glassy. Isn't it? Maybe if I'd been a better husband, she wouldn't have done this. Don't do that, I said firmly. This is on her. Not you. He didn't say anything, just stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As I sat there, I realized that this wasn't just about Alyssa anymore. It was about everything David had lost, the trust, the stability, the sense of security in his own life. And there was nothing I could do to give it back to him. In the weeks that followed, David tried to rebuild his life, but the cracks left by Alyssa's betrayal were hard to patch over. He threw himself into work, often staying late at the office, avoiding the empty house that used to feel like a home. I stopped by often, trying to keep him company. Most of the time, he seemed fine, calm, collected, but every now and then, I'd catch him staring into the distance, his thoughts clearly somewhere painful. She texted me, he said one evening as we sat on the back porch, beers in hand. What did she say? She wants to talk, he said, his jaw tightening. Says she regrets everything and wants to explain. Are you going to meet her? I asked cautiously. He stared at his beer for a long moment before shaking his head. What's the point? She made her choices. She didn't care about me then, so why should I care about what she has to say now? I didn't argue. He was right, and I wasn't about to try to convince him otherwise. But then he looked at me, his eyes clouded with doubt. Do you think I made the right decision? Kicking her out? You didn't have a choice, I said firmly. She crossed the line, David. You don't deserve what she did to you. He nodded, but I could tell the answer didn't bring him much comfort. A few nights later, David called me, his voice unusually tense. She came by the house, he said. Alyssa? Yeah. She just showed up out of nowhere. What happened? She begged me to let her in, he said, his voice trembling. Said she needed to talk. That she had something important to tell me. And, I let her in, he admitted, and I could hear the guilt in his voice. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to hear what she had to say. Maybe I was hoping she'd say something to make it all make sense. What did she say? David let out a shaky breath. She said she's pregnant. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? She claims it's mine, he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. But after everything, how can I believe her? How can I trust anything she says? I didn't know what to say. The idea of Alyssa having a child, David's child, or worse, someone else's, was almost too much to process. What are you going to do? I asked finally. She wants to do a paternity test, he said. I told her I'd consider it. David, are you sure that's a good idea? He sighed. I don't know. But if there's even a chance the baby's mine, I have to know. I can't just ignore it. A week later, the test results came back. Alyssa had insisted on being present when David opened the envelope, and he agreed to let her come over, though he asked me to be there for support. The tension in the room was suffocating as David tore open the envelope, his hands shaking. Alyssa sat across from him, her eyes wide with hope or desperation. He read the results in silence, his face unreadable. Well? Alyssa asked, her voice trembling. David set the paper down, his expression hardening. It's not mine! Alyssa gasped, her face crumpling. That's not possible, she whispered. David stood, his posture stiff. We're done, Alyssa. For good this time. She tried to argue, but he didn't listen. He opened the door and waited for her to leave, his silence more final than any words could have been. After she was gone, David sat back down, burying his face in his hands. I sat beside him, not saying anything. There was nothing to say. For the first time in weeks, David looked like he could finally start to heal.